Ravenloft and Dragonlance shaped modern D&D and even Critical Role, which in no way could exist if it weren't for them. The two original classics regarded by veteran D&D players as D&D staples were both created by the visionary minds of Tracy and Laura Hickman only 5 months apart from each other, planting the seeds for two of the most iconic campaign settings ever, at a time that the Forgotten Realms didn't even exist. But they are much more than outstanding adventures. They sparked a revolution whose repercussions are deeply rooted in how we play Dungeons and Dragons today. But what was so revolutionary about them? At a time that D&D adventures were basically starting from your home base, getting a quest, exploring the regional wilderness or finding a dungeon to kill monsters and acquire treasure, come back town, buy equipment, get a new quest, and go back to another adventure, something bothered Tracy Hickman in his home game adventures. His party was inside a dungeon, they opened a door, and inside the room there was a vampire. Tracy was baffled. He liked so much the image of classic vampire films and books, and encountering that vampire inside that room with no context, with no motivation, with no goals, with no atmosphere, in the middle of a lot of different monsters, felt like a waste of such a character. Then, for his Halloween game, when he was DMing, Tracy decided to do an adventure that surrounded the villain of a vampire. And that was how Count Strahd von Zarovich was born. Hickman started to publish, along with his wife Laura, a few indie adventures under the Daystar West Media banner, the company that they made to publish those adventures. In the first published adventure, in its introduction, he wrote a few lines that became what is known today as the Hickman Manifesto. Among other things, he said that adventures should have an intriguing story that is intricately woven into play. He also said that that story should have a beginning, which would give objectives for players that were more interesting than acquiring experience and gold, and that it should come to a closure, like regular stories, instead of being an open-ended quest, and that dungeons should have an architectural sense. It didn't take long until the Hickmans were hired by TSR in 1982. Working there, they published 3 adventures. The 4th one would be Ravenloft. Ravenloft was the start of the Hickman revolution. It was innovative in many different ways. First, it was a gothic horror adventure in an environment where almost every D&D adventure were classic fantasy. But it was much more than that. Its major villain, Strahd, had goals, an agenda, and layered and complex motivations. He would show up throughout the entire adventure, bedeviling the player characters. The story was a melodrama about classic vampires, surrounding lust, betrayal, despair, and love beyond the grave. But all that story was the backdrop for players' activities. Every bit of it was discovered through gameplay, an innovation at the time. Another innovation were the fortunes of Ravenloft. At the very start of the adventure, the DM would read the character's fortunes through a tarot deck, which would place different items and objectives in different rooms of Castle Ravenloft, the main adventure dungeon. It was not only a way of preventing spoilers, but that actually foreshadowed things that would happen in the adventure future. Castle Ravenloft, by the way, was a radically different and innovative dungeon at the time. Its map, it not only had the architectural sense that Trace Hickman said that adventures should have, but it also was presented in a 3D isometric map that no adventure had published before. Ravenloft was a radical shift towards cerebral adventures centered on intriguing plots. It made a move from open-ended quests to plot-driven adventures. After Ravenloft publication came Hickman's fifth adventure, and the role-playing game world would never be the same again. It was the end of 1982, and TSR, then the owners of Dungeons & Dragons, were struggling to keep its doors open. All workers were involved in a project to save the company. And that's when Tracy and Laura Hickman made their Dragonlance pitch. When they were traveling cross-country from Utah to Wisconsin to start working at TSR, they were talking during their journey and about an adventure that could involve dragons that were long missing from a world that would resurface, shaking the political structures of that world. PCs and NPCs would ride those dragons as mounts, and they thought that that could bring the excitement back to dragons in the role-playing games. I wonder why that strikes me like a premise that could have been used in some recent TV show. I don't know why. Anyways, that sparked a never-before-seen role-playing gaming multimedia project, rooted on a trilogy of novels. That was the point in which Margaret Weiss was involved. She became the writer of those books, co-authoring them with Tracy Hickman, who would develop the world-building and storytelling associated with this mega story about to be told. That became 12 adventure modules that were published throughout 2.5 years, 4 connected to each novel. Throughout that time, 2.5 million sales of modules, of Dragonlance modules, were made, a record-breaking sales for that point. They had all kinds of spin-offs, from calendars to miniatures. Hickman took the Ravenloft innovations much further. The story was not anymore focused on the non-player character, on the villain like Strahd in Ravenloft, but rather focused on the player characters in a very unconventional way for the time. The adventure came with 8 pre-generated characters, the companions or heroes of the lance. Until then, that kind of pre-generated characters were only used in tournament adventures and never in home games. They were involved in the plot, in the adventure plot, in important ways. Not only that, but they were the novel protagonists, and the adventures reproduced the situations that could be found on those novels. As the story and the adventures advanced, new pre-generated characters were introduced, which players could use to switch the character that they would play for a module, or even replace characters that had died in previous adventures. The excitement of taking the shoes of the novel's protagonists took players and DMs like a fever. The modules were stringed together as a long-haul campaign, and everybody wanted more. That marked the shift of self-contained adventure modules to adventure campaigns that are so common in role-playing games to this day. Dragonlance detractors claim that it was a huge railroad adventure campaign, but those who say that are severely mistaken and clearly have never read any of its modules. The situations were the same as presented in the novels, but the outcomes could play out entirely differently. Dragons of Despair, the first Dragonlance module, had only half a page about the world of Kryn, and only 1 paragraph of backstory for every pre-generated character. It had innovative handouts, poems, and even a song with a music score came within the book. The story was a single plot sandbox spread across a hex crawl in which elements of the story would show up throughout each of the encounters that players could play in whichever order they happen to encounter. And all of them would lead to a final dungeon, which was the most unconventional dungeon published to that date. it was not a cavern or a tower or anything like that. It was actually a fallen and shattered city on a swamp. There were no stairs to access different levels of the dungeon. Rather, you had chains and sewers, vines, chimneys, vertical shafts, all of that presented in a gorgeous isometric 3D map that made players and DM blow their minds to the new reaches that D&D adventures could reach. Ravenloft and Dragonlance would not only change D&D forever, but its shift towards storytelling would go on to impact first the entire role-playing games industry. It wouldn't take long before its tectonic shift was felt in the video game industry as well. Without them, storytelling-focused campaigns such as Critical Role would never exist. Some of its ingenious innovations, however, are seldom used in published campaigns nowadays. That is true for its single-plot sandbox approach and its pre-generated characters. But the exciting impacts of those innovations on gameplay have inspired me to use them as the foundation to publish my upcoming campaign. Murder in Arabel is a single-plot sandbox campaign that will keep players guessing along its many twists and turns. As they freely explore the city of Arabel, players will unravel a complex plot of greed, corruption, jealousy, love, and revenge. This deep immersion adventure takes a singular approach to create a character-driven campaign like no other. Players can choose among 6 highly customizable pre-generated characters whose backstories seamlessly tie into the adventure story, providing meaningful opportunities to roleplay and develop their characters' arcs however they want. If all that excites you as well, follow me closely over the next few weeks and be one of the first to play Murder in Arabel by joining our alpha test.